My wife's lawyer served me papers at work. I handed him an envelope that destroyed her case in court. Hello, and welcome. I'm so glad you decided to press play today. Before we begin, I want you to get comfortable, because the story you are about to hear is one you won't forget. This isn't just another tale of betrayal. This is a masterclass in quiet justice, a story about a man who was backed into a corner, publicly humiliated, and left for dead by the people he loved most. But they made one fatal mistake. They forgot who he was. If you've ever craved a story where the underdog doesn't just fight back, but dismantles an entire empire with nothing but patience and pure intelligence, then you are in for a truly satisfying ride. So please, do yourself a favor. Subscribe now if you haven't already, and settle in. You will want to see how this ends. Trust me, the phone call that ended James Bernard's marriage lasted precisely 17 seconds. It wasn't his wife's voice on the other end, but it was her message, a declaration of war delivered by a stranger. What she didn't know, what none of them could possibly know, was that for the last 182 days, James had been preparing to send a message back. His was not a declaration. It was a verdict, and it would burn their entire world to the ground. But that moment was still an hour away. For now, there was only the hum. It was 7:00 p.m., and James was in his sanctuary, a corner office on the 42nd floor that felt more like the cockpit of a deep space vessel than a corporate suite. 3 monitors glowed, their cool light painting his face in shades of silver and blue. To his employers at Sterling Price Financial, he was the head of corporate security, the silent guardian of their billion-dollar secrets. He was a ghost in their machine, a man whose value lay in his invisibility. His focus was absolute. He could tell by the fractional dip in the network's data transfer rate that the third-floor analysts were running an unsanctioned crypto miner again. He could tell by the subtle distortion in the audio feed from the lobby that the leftmost speaker was a week away from blowing out. These were the details that composed his world, a symphony of systems, patterns, and anomalies. He was the conductor. His life was a fortress of control built to keep chaos at bay. But another kind of chaos had already breached the walls. It had been a slow, creeping infiltration, so quiet he had almost missed it. It was in the way his wife, Rebecca, now held her phone angled away from him. It was in the sudden, cheerful emptiness of her weekend plans, which no longer seemed to have room for him. It was in the almost pitying glances she gave him when he'd come home, exhausted from a 14-hour day spent ensuring the fortress that funded their perfect life remained secure. He had built that life with the same meticulous care he applied to his work. The sprawling home in Oak Ridge, the equestrian lessons for his daughter Maya, the top-tier preparatory school for his son Troy. He was the architect and the engineer of their happiness, a provider in the most absolute sense of the word. He thought that was his mission. He was wrong. The mission, it turned out, had been a lie. Have you ever poured your entire soul into something, a job, a family, a relationship, only to wake up one day and realize you've become invisible in the very world you created? It's a chilling, lonely feeling, isn't it? Share your thoughts in the comments below. This is a story for anyone who's ever felt unseen. On his third monitor, the one firewalled from the company network and triple encrypted, he pulled up his private project. It had no name, only a symbol, a hydra. It was a complex, terrifying map of whispers and shadows, a web of connections that linked his esteemed mother-in-law, Judge Cecilia Peter, to a dark constellation of shell corporations, back-channel deals, and one very specific, very buried legal case from 15 years ago. He called it his in case of emergency file. For months, it had been a theoretical exercise, a way to keep his old skills sharp. The skills he'd learned in places where a single miscalculation could get your whole team killed. He'd hoped it would stay theoretical forever. Hope, he was learning, was a rookie mistake. Miles away, in a restaurant where the cutlery chimed like tiny bells against porcelain plates, Rebecca Bernard swirled a glass of blood-red wine. "He's just a function, Mother," she said, her voice a carefully modulated whisper. "He goes to work. He comes home. He provides. The man I married, the one with that fire in his eyes, is gone. He's just a ghost in a suit." Her mother, Judge Cecilia Peter, regarded her with an expression of cool, clinical sympathy. Cecilia was a woman carved from granite and ambition, her posture as unbending as her will. "Darling, ghosts serve a purpose until you no longer need to be haunted." James was a stepping stone, a solid, reliable one, I'll grant you. But your path leads higher now. Sentiment is a liability we can't afford. "It will be ugly," Rebecca murmured, looking at the heavy diamond on her finger. A relic from a past she was now treating like a hostile takeover. "It will be surgical," Cecilia corrected, her voice precise and sharp. "Mr. Davies is the finest shark in the tank. He will serve the papers at James's office. A public forum. It establishes a narrative of his absence, his dedication to his job over his family. It's a small, tactical humiliation designed to ensure a swift surrender. He won't have the resources or the will to fight. We will have the children, the house, and our peace. He will have his pride, what's left of it." Rebecca nodded slowly, letting her mother's cold logic wash over her, soothing the faint, inconvenient prickle of guilt. This was right. This was necessary. It was an amputation designed to save the patient. She was the patient. James was the disease. The buzz of the intercom on James's desk was an electric shock in the quiet room. It was the night guard from the lobby. The protocol was clear. He was not to be disturbed unless the building was on fire or under siege. "Mr. Bernard?" "My apologies for the interruption, sir." The young guard's voice was tinny, nervous. "There's a Mr. Davies here to see you. He says he's an attorney. For your wife. Sir, he's refusing to leave." There it was. The emergency. The hum in the room disappeared. The glow from the monitors seemed to dim. For a single, frozen second, the ghost in the machine felt the cold steel of the knife slide between his ribs. The shock was real, a white-hot flash of pain. He had seen it coming, but the impact was still breathtaking. He felt his lungs tighten, his vision narrow. Then something else took over. The training. The part of him that was forged in fire and betrayal. The shock receded, replaced by an astonishing, absolute calm. His heart rate, which had spiked, returned to its resting 60 beats per minute. The world snapped back into hyperfocus. He wasn't a husband anymore. He wasn't a victim. He was an operator, and the mission had just gone live. "It's all right, Alex," James said, and he was surprised by the steadiness of his own voice. It was a stranger's voice. Cold. Controlled. "Thank you for letting me know. Send him up to the main boardroom on this floor. I'll meet him there." He disconnected the call. He didn't look at the family photo on his desk. He didn't allow himself a single tremor of rage or sorrow. Emotion was a luxury he couldn't afford right now. Emotion was what they were counting on. With a deliberate, unhurried motion, he stood. He walked to the steel filing cabinet in the corner, a relic in his otherwise digital world. He entered a 10-digit code, and the top drawer slid open with a well-oiled whisper. Inside, nestled between old service medals and a faded map of Kandahar, was a single, standard-issue manila envelope. It was thick, but not too thick. Heavy, but not too heavy. It had no label. It needed none. He picked it up, feeling its familiar weight in his hand. He had prepared it 6 months ago, sealed it, and placed it here. A dead man's switch. A final option he prayed he would never have to use. He closed the drawer, turned, and walked out of his office. His footsteps were silent on the plush carpeting as he moved down the empty corridor toward the boardroom. Toward the shark his wife had sent to devour him. The man in the suit was gone. The ghost was gone. What walked that hall now was something else entirely. Something they had forgotten. Something they had created. And he was about to remind them. The boardroom was a cathedral of corporate power, designed to make allies feel important and adversaries feel small. A vast, polished mahogany table reflected the glittering skyline of the city, 100 points of light staring back like disinterested eyes. Mr. Davies sat at the head of this table as if it were his throne. He was a man who radiated expensive confidence, from his hand-stitched Italian shoes to the gold signet ring on his pinky finger. He looked at James, not as an equal, but as an obstacle to be efficiently removed. "Mr. Bernard," Davies began, his voice smooth as aged whiskey. He slid a thick stack of documents across the polished surface. The sound was like ice cracking. "I am Arthur Davies, representing your wife, Rebecca Bernard. These are for you." James didn't look at the papers. His eyes were fixed on the lawyer. He registered the slight tremor of excitement in the man's hands, the predatory gleam in his eyes. This wasn't just a job for Davies. It was a sport. "It's a petition for dissolution of marriage," Davies continued, clearly enjoying the theatricality of it all. "It includes a motion for sole physical and legal custody of the children, Troy and Maya, citing your, let's call it all-consuming work schedule and a pattern of emotional unavailability. Furthermore, it details the division of assets. Frankly, it's quite generous, all things considered." He leaned back, steepling his fingers. "My clients, the Peter family, are prepared to be reasonable. If you are, they understand this is a shock. So, we advise you to accept the terms. Sign the papers. A prolonged fight would be unwise and dreadfully expensive." The threat hung in the air, thick and suffocating. "We will ruin you." James stood silent for a long moment. He let the silence stretch, let it become uncomfortable, let it seep into the lawyer's tailored suit and polished ego. He felt the initial, searing shock of the betrayal, the cold, clinical way his life was being dismantled, and he packed it away. He locked it in a box and shoved it into the darkest corner of his mind. He couldn't be a husband right now. He had to be an operator. Finally, he moved. With a slowness that was almost hypnotic, he walked around the table until he stood directly opposite Davies. He placed his own plain, manila envelope on the table. It landed with a soft, insignificant thud that was somehow louder than all the lawyer's blustering. Davies looked at the envelope, then back at James, a smirk playing on his lips. "A counteroffer? Mr. Bernard, I assure you, you are not in a position to negotiate." "It's not an offer," James said. His voice was quiet, devoid of heat, but it cut through the room's sterile air. "It's a response for you to deliver to Judge Cecilia Peter. Personally. Davies chuckled, a dry, patronizing sound. He picked up the envelope, clearly expecting some poorly researched financial documents or a desperate handwritten letter. He tore the flap open with a flourish and tipped the contents onto the table. It wasn't a document. It was a single, faded photograph. The picture showed a woman, unmistakably a younger Cecilia Peter, laughing at a lakeside cabin. Her arm was slung casually around a man with dark, slicked-back hair and a smile that didn't reach his eyes. The man was Marcus Thorne, a real estate developer who had been the central figure in a massive corruption scandal 15 years ago, a scandal judge Peter had presided over the grand jury for. Thorne had vanished without a trace before he could testify. The official story was that he'd fled the country. Cecilia, under oath, had sworn she had only the most distant professional acquaintance with him. This photograph of the two of them in an intimate, relaxed setting was not just a picture. It was a time bomb. It was proof of perjury. It was the key that could unlock a case the entire city thought was dead and buried. Davies stared at it. The smirk on his face didn't just vanish. It was wiped clean, leaving a slack-jawed mask of disbelief. The color drained from his cheeks. He looked up at James, and for the first time, the predatory gleam was gone, replaced by a raw, primal fear. He was no longer looking at a defeated husband. He was looking at a man holding a lit stick of dynamite. "This is. Where did you get this?" Davies stammered, his voice a hoarse whisper. James didn't answer. He simply pushed the photograph back toward the lawyer. "Give my response to the judge," he repeated, his voice still unnervingly calm. "And tell her this is just the table of contents. The rest of the book is far more interesting." He turned and walked out of the boardroom without another word, leaving the shark to choke on the bait. The drive to Judge Peter's estate was a blur for Arthur Davies. He clutched the steering wheel. The image of the photograph burned into his mind. He had built a career on calculated aggression, on knowing exactly how much pressure to apply to make a man break. But James Bernard hadn't broken. He hadn't even bent. He had simply opened a door, and on the other side was a monster Davies didn't know existed. He found Rebecca and her mother in the judge's study, a room of dark wood, leather-bound books, and the suffocating scent of old power. They were celebrating with champagne, 2 crystal flutes gleaming in the lamplight. "Arthur, so soon?" Cecilia said, her smile sharp and triumphant. "I trust Mr. Bernard was receptive." Davies didn't speak. He walked to the ornate mahogany desk and placed the photograph on the leather blotter. Rebecca leaned in, confused. "What's this?" But Cecilia went rigid. She stared at the picture, her face becoming a stony, impenetrable mask. The champagne flute in her hand trembled almost imperceptible. She recognized it instantly. A ghost from a buried life. A mistake she thought had been erased forever. "Where did he get this?" she hissed, her voice a venomous whisper. "He didn't say," Davies replied, his own voice shaky. "He called it our response. He said it was the table of contents." Rebecca looked from the photo to her mother's pale, furious face, her own triumphant mood evaporating into a cloud of confusion and dread. "Mother, what is this? Who is that man?" "It's nothing," Cecilia snapped, snatching the photograph and turning it face down on the desk. She turned to Davies, her eyes blazing with a cold fire. "It's a bluff. A desperate, pathetic bluff from a man with nothing. He's fishing. He found an old photograph, and he thinks it means something." "Cecilia, he wasn't fishing," Davies warned, finding a sliver of his professional courage. "This wasn't a guess. This was a targeted strike. His demeanor, it was not of a man who was guessing. It was a man who already knows the answer. Nonsense, the judge declared, her voice ringing with forced authority. We do not react. We do not flinch. We proceed as planned, only we accelerate. We hit him harder. And they did. The next morning, James woke to find his access to their joint savings account frozen. An email from his bank, cold and robotic, informed him of a legal hold placed by Peter and Associates. Later that day, a courier delivered a new volley of legal threats, including a motion for an emergency custody hearing. The final blow came in the form of a call from his own company's Human Resources Department. A formal inquiry had been made by Judge Peter's office regarding a potential conflict of interest given his access to sensitive financial data. It was a veiled threat to his livelihood. They were trying to bury him, to create so much noise and chaos that he would be too overwhelmed to use the weapon he held. Rebecca, caught in the storm of her mother's creation, clung to the narrative. Her mother was invincible. James was a nobody. This was just the last, desperate thrashing of a drowning man. She repeated it to herself like a mantra, trying to drown out the seed of doubt that the photograph and Davies's sheer terror had planted in her heart. She avoided James's calls, responding only through curt, formal texts composed by her lawyers. She was building a wall, brick by painful brick, hoping it would be strong enough to keep the truth out. The call came a week later, on a Tuesday afternoon. It wasn't a lawyer. It was the headmaster of Northwood Preparatory, the prestigious school Troy attended. There had been an incident. Troy had gotten into a violent altercation, leaving another boy with a broken nose. The school had a zero-tolerance policy. An immediate meeting was required, with both parents. No exceptions. And so, James and Rebecca found themselves sitting side by side in the suffocatingly polite office of Dr. Alastair Finch. It was the first time they had been in the same room in 2 weeks. The space between them on the leather sofa felt like a mile-wide chasm, crackling with unspoken accusations. Rebecca was dressed in a chic, defensive armor of cashmere and pearls. James wore the same quiet suit he always did, but he sat with a stillness that was more imposing than any power suit. Dr. Finch was a man who specialized in grave, gentle disappointment. "Troy is a good boy," he began, his fingers steepled, "but his grades have been slipping for months. He's been distant, angry. Now this level of violence, it doesn't come from nowhere. Children are like seismographs. They register the tremors in their world long before the adults do. Tell me, what's going on at home?" The question hung in the air, a direct hit on the fragile truce of their silence. Rebecca flinched, opening her mouth to offer a sanitized, lawyer-approved explanation. But James spoke first. "We are getting a divorce," he said simply. The words were flat, factual, devoid of the drama and vitriol that had defined the past week. He looked directly at Dr. Finch. "The situation has become adversarial. Our son is paying the price for it." Rebecca shot him a furious glare. "How dare you?" Her eyes screamed. "How dare you be so blunt, so honest here?" The meeting was a painful blur. They agreed to counseling for Troy, a temporary suspension, and a follow-up meeting. When it was over, they walked out into the manicured school courtyard in silence. The sun was bright, the air crisp, but the atmosphere between them was arctic. They stopped near her Mercedes, the chasm between them now, a tangible thing. Was that really necessary? She finally hissed, her voice trembling with rage. airing our dirty laundry like that, humiliating me. James turned to face her fully. For the first time, she wasn't looking at the distant, preoccupied husband she had grown to resent. The ghost was gone. In his place was a man she barely recognized. His eyes, usually calm and observant, were like chips of cold steel. There was no anger in them. There was something far more terrifying, clarity. "You find it humiliating?" he asked, his voice dangerously low. "More humiliating than having a stranger serve me papers in my own boardroom. More humiliating than having my bank accounts frozen. More humiliating than having your mother try to destroy my career." He took a step closer, and she instinctively took a step back. "This isn't about our laundry, Rebecca. This is about our son. That boy in there is falling apart because his mother and grandmother decided a family was a hostile takeover. This is the collateral damage. So you tell me, was it worth it?" His words weren't shouted. They were delivered with the precision of a surgeon's scalpel, and they cut right through her defenses. For the first time since the process began, she was without her mother's voice in her ear, without a lawyer to script her responses. She was alone with this new, formidable version of her husband, and the truth of his words was sickening. She saw the flicker of the man she had once fallen in love with, the intense, focused soldier who saw the world with such fierce integrity. But that fire was no longer there to protect her. It was aimed directly at her. And in that horrifying moment, she realized her mother had been wrong. They hadn't been dealing with a ghost. They had woken a dragon, and they had no idea just how much fire it could breathe. The confrontation in the school courtyard left a fissure in Rebecca's carefully constructed reality. James's words, "This is the collateral damage," echoed in her mind, a relentless, chipping sound against the wall of her denial. For the first time, she saw the battle not as a clean, strategic maneuver, but as a messy, brutal war with her own son bleeding on the front lines. The seed of doubt, planted by the photograph, began to sprout in the new cracks of her certainty. She drove home not to the sprawling, empty house she was trying to claim, but to her mother's estate, seeking the familiar comfort of Cecilia's unshakable resolve. She found the judge not in her study, but in the sterile, climate-controlled room she called the archive. It was a vault, lined with steel shelves, holding dozens of meticulously labeled document boxes, a library of her long and storied legal career. Cecilia was standing before an open box, her back to the door. Rebecca saw her mother slip a small, leather-bound book into her handbag before turning, her composure perfectly restored. "Rebecca, darling," Cecilia said, her smile tight. "I was just organizing, clearing out old files. One must maintain order." "Mother, we need to talk about Troy," Rebecca began, her voice strained. "The meeting with Dr. Finch." "James said." "I know what James said," Cecilia interrupted, her tone dismissive. "He's trying to use the children to manipulate you. It's a classic, desperate tactic. Pathetic, really. We will not allow it to distract us from the goal." "Is it a distraction?" Rebecca pressed, a new, unfamiliar courage rising in her. "Or is it the truth? Troy is in pain. And that photograph, Mother, the one James had. Who was that man? What does James know?" Cecilia's eyes went cold. She walked over to Rebecca and placed her hands on her shoulders, her grip surprisingly firm. "Rebecca, listen to me. Your husband is a clever man. I will grant him that. But he's a security guard. He deals in locks and cameras. I deal in the law. In power. He has found a loose thread from my past, something meaningless, and he is pulling on it, hoping the entire tapestry will unravel. It won't. That tapestry is woven with steel. Do you understand me? You need to hold your nerve. Her mother's words were meant to be reassuring, a fortress of certainty. But for the first time, Rebecca felt like a prisoner within its walls. The mention of the tapestry, the idea of a single loose thread. It felt less like a metaphor and more like a confession. Meanwhile, James was in his own archive. Not a room of paper and ink, but a digital ghost town of encrypted servers and forgotten data trails. The photograph had been the key, the confirmation of a suspicion he'd harbored for years. Now, he was hunting for the lock it opened. His intelligence training in the military hadn't just been about weapons and tactics. It was about people. It was about understanding that every secret leaves a shadow. His most formative lesson had come not in a briefing room, but in a dusty village in Helmand province. Flashback. The air was thick with the smell of chai and fear. He was young, just a lieutenant, sitting across from a village elder named Hakim. His unit was hunting a high-value target, an insurgent leader who was using the village as a sanctuary. Hakim swore, his hand over his heart, that the man was not there. He was convincing. His eyes were steady, his voice firm. But James noticed something else. A tremor, not in the elder's hands, but in the small ceramic teacup sitting on the table between them. Every time the insurgent's name was mentioned, the tea in the cup would ripple, a tiny, almost invisible vibration traveling up from the floorboards. Hakim's leg was bouncing under the table, a nervous tic he couldn't control. Later, James had sat alone, replaying the scene. It wasn't just the tic. It was the way Hakim's grandson, a boy of about 10, had stared at a particular rug in the corner of the room. He never looked at the soldiers, only at the rug. A lie has weight. It creates its own gravity, pulling the truth towards it. James hadn't stormed the house. He'd waited. He'd used a thermal imager that night and found the heat signature of a hidden cellar beneath that very rug. They captured the target without firing a shot. The lesson was seared into his soul. People lie, but patterns don't. The truth is never in the words. It's in the tremor, in the tea. Presentdy. Judge Cecilia Peter was Hakim. Her confident denials were the words. The photograph was the tremor. And James was now looking for the rug. His search for Marcus Thorne, the developer in the photo, had led him to a digital graveyard of defunct corporations and scrubbed public records. But James wasn't looking at the public records. He was a ghost. He slipped through old, forgotten back doors in the city's digital infrastructure, places he knew existed from his security work. He was looking for shadows, for the digital gravity of a 15-year-old lie, and he found it. It wasn't in a legal file. It was in the city's water and power archives, a series of anomalous utility bills for a remote, defunct forestry outpost cabin deep in the mountains north of the city. The bills were paid in cash for 3 full years after the outpost was officially abandoned. The payments stopped the same month Marcus Thorne officially vanished. It was a thread. He cross-referenced the cabin's location with cell tower data from that period, a painstaking process of pulling archaic logs. He found what he was looking for, dozens of pings from a burner phone. And on 3 specific dates, those burner phone pings overlapped with pings from a phone registered to the Peter family trust. The phone Cecilia used for private family matters. The tapestry was starting to unravel. He drove for 3 hours, up winding mountain roads, until the pavement gave way to a rutted dirt track. The air grew thin and smelled of pine and damp earth. He found the cabin exactly where the old map said it would be. It was dilapidated, sagging, slowly being reclaimed by the wilderness. The door hung on one hinge. Inside, the cabin was a wreck of mold and decay. Raccoons and time had ravaged the place. It smelled of rot and forgotten secrets. He moved through the small space with a quiet, practiced patience, his eyes scanning every surface. He wasn't looking for anything specific. He was listening for the story the room wanted to tell. He found it under a loose floorboard in the corner, the same corner where a child might stare if they were hiding a secret. It wasn't a document or a weapon. It was a small, leather-bound journal. The cover was warped and stained, but the writing inside, protected from the elements, was still legible. It was Marcus Thorne's diary. James sat on the dusty floor, the fading afternoon light filtering through the grimy windows, and began to read. The entries were a mix of paranoia, arrogance, and terror. Thorne wrote about the deal he'd made with the judge, how she'd used her position to steer the grand jury away from him in exchange for a cut of the profits from his corrupt real estate developments. But then the deal had soured. An investigative reporter had started digging. Cecilia, fearing exposure, had panicked. She hadn't helped him escape. She had forced him into hiding here, in this cabin, a prisoner fed and supplied by a proxy, promising to get him out of the country when things cooled down. The final entries were terrifying. Thorne realized she was never going to let him go. He was a loose end. He wrote about a final visit she had promised, a final plan. The last entry was dated November 12, 15 years ago. It was chillingly simple. She's coming tonight. With her husband. Says they have a boat arranged. I don't trust her. I feel it in my bones. She's not coming to save me. She's coming to silence me. I'm burying this under the floor. If anyone ever finds this, know that Judge Cecilia Peter is not a guardian of the law. She is a murderer. James closed the journal, his hands steady, but his heart pounding against his ribs. The air in the cabin was thick with the weight of the story. This was no longer about perjury or a financial crime. This was about a man's life, a man who'd been silenced and erased by the woman who was now trying to take his children. He stood up, the journal feeling impossibly heavy in his hand. He had the whole book now. The entire ugly story. The tremor in the tea had led him to a grave. As he drove back down the mountain, the sun setting behind him, he knew this was no longer about winning a divorce. It was no longer about revenge. It was about justice. It was about protecting his children not just from a toxic grandmother, but from a legacy of evil they could never comprehend. And he realized, with a cold, terrifying certainty, that he was the only person who could stop her. The ghost in the machine had just become a hunter. The following Saturday arrived with a fragile, sunlit calm that felt entirely at odds with the storm raging beneath the surface. It was James's court-mandated weekend with the children. When Rebecca's sleek Mercedes pulled up to the curb of his new, sterile apartment building, she didn't just drop them off and speed away. She got out of the car. Troy and Maya ran to him, their hugs a desperate anchor in the turbulent sea of the past few weeks. Over their heads, James's eyes met Rebecca's. He saw no animosity in them, just a deep, cavernous exhaustion. The armor was gone. His counselor said he needs routine, she said, her voice quiet, almost hesitant. Normalcy, or as close as we can get. James nodded, understanding the unspoken plea. This wasn't about them. It was about the two small people looking up at them, their faces a mixture of hope and confusion. I was going to take them to the park, the one by the old house. Get some pizza after, the way we used to. A flicker of memory of a simpler, happier time passed between them. He'd like that, she said, her gaze falling on Troy, who was now kicking at a loose stone on the pavement, his shoulders hunched. He needs that. She looked back at James, and for the first time in what felt like a lifetime, she looked at him not as an adversary, but as a partner. James, be good to them. I always am, he replied, and there was no sting in his words, only a quiet statement of fact. The day was an oasis. In the wide, open green of the park, away from the oppressive silence of courtrooms and the sharp edges of legal documents, James wasn't an operator or a plaintiff. He was just Dad. He pushed Maya on the swings until she shrieked with laughter, her pigtails flying. He threw a football with Troy, not talking about school or the fight, but just letting the familiar rhythm of catch and throw mend the space between them. He saw the anger in his son begin to unclench, replaced by a tentative joy. He saw the worry lines on his daughter's brow smooth out. For the first time, he let them see the cracks in his own stoic facade. He told them stories about his first clunky car, about the time he accidentally dyed his hair orange in college. He let them see him as a person, not just a provider. Later, sitting in the noisy, chaotic pizzeria, a piece of pepperoni hanging from Troy's chin, James felt a profound shift inside him. He looked at their faces, alive with simple happiness, and the cold fire of his anger cooled into something else, a fierce, protective warmth. Marcus Thorne's journal, safely locked away, was no longer a weapon of revenge against Rebecca. It was a shield to protect his children from Cecilia. The fight wasn't about winning anymore. It was about saving them from the poison he now knew ran through the very heart of their mother's family. Have you ever had a moment of pure clarity, where all the anger and noise fade away, and you realize what you're truly fighting for? It's a powerful, grounding feeling. It changes everything. He brought the children back that evening, feeling a sense of peace he hadn't known was possible. As they walked towards Rebecca's front door, the door to the house he had bought, the home he was no longer welcome in, he saw it was open. And standing in the doorway, framed by the warm light of the foyer, was Judge Cecilia Peter. Her smile was a predatory slash of red lipstick. "There are my grandbabies," she chirped, her voice a weapon wrapped in velvet. A cold dread washed over James. This was a violation of the unspoken truce. He watched as Cecilia knelt, enveloping Troy and Maya in a hug that seemed possessive, suffocating. She held them there, her eyes locked on James over their heads, and her gaze was one of pure, triumphant malice. The shatter point came not with a bang, but with a whisper. James stood on the porch, a silent sentinel, as Cecilia led the children inside. He could hear her voice, sweet and venomous, drifting through the open door. "I know this has all been so confusing," she was saying to them, her tone dripping with manufactured sympathy. "Your father, he's going through a difficult time. His job is very stressful, and sometimes, when people are under that much pressure, they get confused. They make things up. They try to hurt people because they are hurting." James felt the blood freeze in his veins. He saw Rebecca standing by the staircase, her face pale, a silent, horrified witness to her mother's poison. Cecilia continued, her voice weaving a masterful web of manipulation. "He's trying to take you away from your mother. He's telling lies about me, about our family, because he's angry. He can't have this house anymore. But I won't let him. I will protect you. You know Grandma will always protect you, don't you?" Troy, his fragile peace shattered, looked confused and betrayed. Maya's face crumpled, her lip trembling as she looked towards the door, towards her father. That was it. The line had been crossed. James stepped into the foyer. The warmth of the house felt like a furnace. He didn't look at Cecilia. He looked only at Rebecca. "Get her out," he said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. Cecilia stood up, her face a mask of outrage. "How dare you speak to me that way in my daughter's home?" "This is my home," James countered, his voice like gravel. "The one my name is on. The one my paychecks built. And you are not welcome in it. Not now. Not ever." He turned his eyes back to Rebecca, and the full force of his disillusionment hit her like a physical blow. I told you what this would do to them. And you let her do it. You stood there and you let her pour poison into their ears." "James, Rebecca started, her voice a fractured whisper. She was trapped, paralyzed between the monster she was raised by and the man she had betrayed. "I thought, for a moment, today, that there was something left to save," he said, his voice raw with a pain that was deeper than anger. "Something for the kids. I was wrong." He looked at Cecilia, at her smug, unrepentant face, and then back to his wife. "I always knew she was ruthless. I saw it in the way she moved through the world. What I never knew, what I never could have imagined." He took a breath, the words tasting like ash. "Is that you or this weak?" The word weak hung in the air between them, shimmering with a terrible, final clarity. It wasn't an insult. It was a diagnosis, and it was true. It severed the last, microscopic thread that connected them. In that moment, Rebecca saw herself through his eyes, not as a powerful woman reclaiming her life, but as a puppet, her strings held by the smiling, venomous woman standing beside her. The shame was a physical sensation, a hot wave that threatened to suffocate her. James knelt and looked at his children. "I love you both," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Nothing that anyone says will ever change that. I'll see you soon." He stood, gave Rebecca one last, lingering look of profound, heartbreaking disappointment, and walked out the door, closing it softly behind him. The click of the latch echoed through the house like a gunshot, signaling the end of everything. The 2 days that followed were a silent, waking nightmare for Rebecca. James's final word, weak, was a ghost that haunted every room of the house. She looked at her mother, now bustling around the kitchen, humming a cheerful tune as if she hadn't just emotionally brutalized her own grandchildren, and she felt a sickening revulsion. The powerful, brilliant matriarch she had always admired suddenly looked grotesque, a predator in a pearl necklace. The tapestry of her mother's power, the one she had claimed was woven of steel, was fraying before her very eyes, and she could see the ugly, dark threads it was made of. She was trapped. To defy her mother was to lose everything: the financial support, the legal machine, the entire world she knew. To stand with her was to lose her children's souls, and her own. James, meanwhile, spent those 2 days in a state of cold, quiet fury. Peace he'd felt at the park was gone, burned away by Cecilia's poison. He sat in his sterile apartment, Marcus Thorne's journal on the table in front of him. It was no longer a shield. It was a weapon. And he was ready to use it, but not in a courtroom. A courtroom was Cecilia's world. She could twist it, manipulate it, bury it in motions and appeals for years. His battlefield was information. His weapon was the truth. He made a single call to a name he'd pulled from his memory banks: Ben Carter, an investigative journalist known for his tenacity and his integrity. A man who had a history of taking on the city's untouchables. They met in a noisy diner, a place of anonymity. James didn't show him the journal. Not yet. He showed him the photograph. He laid out the timeline of the utility bills for the cabin and the overlapping cell phone pings. He gave him the thread. Judge Peter presented herself as a passive arbiter in the Thorn scandal, James said, his voice level. This evidence suggests she was an active participant. Start digging there. See what you find. Carter's eyes, trained to spot the anatomy of a cover-up, lit up with a familiar fire. This is a hell of a start, Mr. Bernard, but it's circumstantial. To go after a sitting judge, I need more. Something undeniable. You'll have it, James said. But first, I'm giving her one last chance to choose. That evening, a courier delivered a small, sealed box to Rebecca. There was no note. Inside, resting on a bed of black velvet, was a single state-of-the-art listening device, a bug, identical to the ones James used to secure the boardrooms at Sterling Price. Beneath it was a burner phone. She knew instantly what it was, what it meant. It was a choice. An hour later, the burner phone rang. She answered, her hand trembling. "Hello, Rebecca," James's voice said, clear and devoid of any emotion. It was the voice of the operator. "You have a decision to make. Your mother is not going to stop. She will destroy our children to save herself. You know I'm right. What do you want me to do?" She whispered, tears streaming down her face. "I want you to save them," he said. "I'm giving you a choice you didn't give me. You can either stand with her and go down with her, or you can help me stop her. The man I spoke to today, the journalist, he's going to break the story. But the story he has now is just about financial corruption and perjury. I have the rest of it. The part that ends in a cabin in the mountains. The threat was clear, and it was terrifying. You have until noon tomorrow," he continued. "Talk to her. Get her to admit what she did. Get the truth for Troy, for Maya. Use the device. Or don't. Either way, the story is coming out. The only question is whether you'll be a witness or a co-conspirator. The choice is yours." He hung up. Rebecca stared at the bug in her hand. It felt cold, heavy. It was the key to her damnation or her redemption. She had to face her mother. She had to choose between the woman who gave her life and the man who was offering her a chance to reclaim it. She walked out of her room, the small device clutched in her fist, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. The reckoning had arrived. The next morning, the air in Judge Peter's mansion was thick with a brittle, triumphant tension. Cecilia was on the phone with her legal team, her voice crisp and commanding, orchestrating the final crushing blow against James. Rebecca sat on a silk armchair in the corner of the study, a silent observer, the small listening device, a cold, heavy secret in her pocket. She felt like a ghost, invisible in the eye of the hurricane her mother was creating. Her choice had been made the moment she saw the terror in her own children's eyes. She waited until Cecilia hung up the phone, a smug, satisfied smile on her face. "It's almost over, darling," the judge said, turning to her. "Another day or two, and he'll be completely neutralized." "His threats are meaningless." "Are they?" Rebecca asked, her voice surprisingly steady. She stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the perfectly manicured gardens that felt like the grounds of a beautiful prison. "Last night, I looked through some of your old things. Your journals from back then. It was a lie, but it was the right bait. Cecilia's smile faltered. Why would you do that? I was curious, Rebecca said, turning back to face her. About Marcus Thorne. The name landed in the room like a stone, and the silence it created was absolute. Cecilia's face became a mask of cold fury. We do not speak that name. You did, though, Rebecca pressed, her heart hammering against her ribs. She was channeling James's calm, his focus. In the journals, you wrote about him, about how he was a problem, a loose end. She took a breath. You wrote about the cabin, Mother. Cecilia's composure finally cracked. She took a step forward, her eyes blazing. You went through my private things? After everything I have done for you, everything I am doing for you? To protect this family, to protect you from the mistake you made in marrying that man? Did you protect me? Or did you just use him the way you used Marcus Thorne? Rebecca's voice rose, filled with the pain of a lifetime of suppressed truths. James has proof, Mother. He has more than just the photograph. He knows about the cabin. He knows you didn't help Thorne escape. He knows you silenced him. It was a gamble, a shot in the dark based on James's cryptic warning. But the look on her mother's face, a flash of pure, primal terror, quickly masked by rage, was a confession. He knows nothing. Cecilia spat, her voice a venomous hiss. She grabbed Rebecca's arms, her manicured nails digging into her skin. He is a nobody, a gnat. I did what I had to do to protect our family, to protect our name. Thorne was a greedy fool who was going to bring us all down. He made his choice. I simply finalized it. I built this world for you. Everything you have because I was strong enough to do what men like your husband are too weak to do. The words tumbled out, a torrent of long-buried poison. And in the silent study, the tiny device in Rebecca's pocket captured every single syllable. The confession, the motive, the chilling, remorseless truth. Rebecca pulled away, her face a canvas of horror and disgust. No, she whispered. You didn't build a world. You built a tomb. And you've been trying to bury us all in it. Before Cecilia could react, Rebecca turned and walked out of the study, out of the house, and out of the life she had been born into. She didn't look back. At 11:45 a.m., 15 minutes before James's deadline, she met Ben Carter in the same diner James had. She didn't speak. She simply placed the small listening device and Marcus Thorne's faded journal, which James had instructed a courier to deliver to her, on the table. She laid the truth out for him to see. The story broke that evening. It wasn't just a story, it was an earthquake. It led every newscast, the headline blazing across the screen, JUDGE, CECILIAMPELICETEEDDINFIFTEEIAEEIOSSK. The audio of her confession was the epicenter, a chilling, undeniable broadcast of guilt. The corroborating details from Thorne's journal were the aftershocks, dismantling decades of public trust in minutes. The downfall was swift and brutal. Within hours, Judge Peter's office swarmed by federal agents. Her assets were frozen, truly frozen, by the unassailable power of the U.S. government. The legal machine she had built to crush James was now focused on its own desperate and ultimately futile defense. In the midst of the media firestorm, the divorce proceedings became a footnote. In a quiet, sterile courtroom, stripped of all its drama, James's lawyer presented the facts. There was no argument. The motions against him were withdrawn. The custody battle was over before it began. He was granted full legal and physical custody of Troy and Maya. A week later, Rebecca met him on the same park bench where he had found a moment of peace with their children. She looked smaller, stripped of the armor of wealth and power. She was just a woman, facing the devastating consequences of her choices. "They're going to charge me," she said, not looking at him, "as an accessory after the fact. My lawyers are arranging a plea. I'll be gone for a while." James sat in silence, just listening. There was no triumph in him, no "I told you so." The victory felt somber, heavy. "I know I don't have the right to ask for anything," she continued, her voice choked with tears. "But the children, will you tell them? Will you tell them I love them? And that I'm sorry. They know you love them, Rebecca," he said softly. "And one day, they might understand that you were sorry." She finally looked at him, her eyes filled with a universe of regret. "He was never a ghost, was he? The man I married. I was the one who was blind." "We both were," James said, "and it was an offering of grace. We just woke up at different times." She nodded, a single tear tracing a path down her cheek. She stood up, said a quiet, final goodbye, and walked away, a solitary figure moving towards her reckoning. James stayed on the bench as the sun began to set, the sky painted in hues of orange and purple. A few minutes later, he saw them, Troy and Maya, running towards him across the grass, their faces bright and full of life. He stood up and opened his arms, and they crashed into him, a tangle of limbs and laughter. He held them tight, burying his face in their hair, breathing in the scent of their shampoo and the fresh, clean air. He felt the weight of the last few months, the anger, the fear, the cold resolve, all of it finally lifting, dissolving into the evening sky. He had dismantled an empire, exposed a monster, and won a war he never wanted to fight. But as he walked away from the bench, a child's hand clasped firmly in each of his, he knew this was the only victory that ever mattered. Not the downfall of his enemies, but the reclaiming of his family. He wasn't a ghost or an operator anymore. He was a father, whole, present, and finally, truly at peace. He was walking them home. Thank you for joining us on this incredible journey. The story of James Bernard is a powerful reminder that true strength isn't about the noise you make, but about the quiet integrity you hold onto when everything is on the line. It's about fighting not for revenge, but for the future, for peace, and for the people you love. We tell stories like this because we believe in the power of the human spirit to overcome even the most profound betrayals. If this story moved you, if it gave you a sense of hope or justice, please let us know in the comments. Your thoughts and reflections are what build this community. And if you haven't already, please take a moment to subscribe and turn on notifications. We have so many more powerful stories to share with you, and we wouldn't want you to miss a single one. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you next time.